Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Musgrove, and we're bringing you an additional episode this week to talk about the potential new rules that could impact how Premier League teams are allowed to spend their money. To get some expert analysis on this and what it might mean for Newcastle United, it's a pleasure to welcome to the show Dr. Tom Bason, a football finance expert from Coventry University. Tom, thank you very much for popping on the show. Are you keeping well?
I'm very well, thank you. I hope you are as well.
Yeah, I'm all good. Thank you very much. These new rules that potentially could come in for the 2025-26 season are the topic of discussion across social media, across lots of fan bases, and there's a lot of interest, especially from a Newcastle United point of view. I think where we should start with, Tom, is just by kind of introducing what these changes are and the impact it could have on the Premier League. So would you like to explain to our listeners and viewers just what these changes are, first off?
Yeah, so these new changes that were kind of announced yesterday, they've been mentioned over the last the last week or so, appear to be a cap on the total spend that clubs can make on transfers, players, agent costs. For the first time, this seems to be linked to not the revenue that the club itself makes, but the revenue that's earned by the Premier League. So it's going to be anchored to the revenues made by the club that earns the least from the league's centralised deals. Appears to be broadcast and commercial deals combined, which was about 103 million-ish last season, which was earned by Southampton.
So with that in mind, there's the belief that this multiple is going to be somewhere in the region of 4.5 to 5. So if we take 4.5, Tom, that would work out at 466 million. But clubs have also got to be within 85% of their club revenue. So it's up to the limit of 466 million, but also that percentage of their club revenue. But there is also the UEFA rules, which means clubs competing in Europe can only spend 70% of club revenue. And that's maybe something that's been potentially missed by people who have seen these potential Premier League rules changing and maybe not been aware of the UEFA rules. Because if you are a Newcastle United, for example, and you're in Europe, you're not going to be able to spend as much as a club maybe coming up behind you who doesn't have to adhere to that 70%.
Except for the clubs who are in the Premier League are still going to have to adhere to the new profitability and sustainability regulations. So basically, the current PSR regulations say that a club can make a 5 million loss a year, boosted to 35 million if the owners put the funding into the club. That's done on a 3-year rolling cycle, giving a max 105 million loss. And those are the regulations that Nottingham Forest and Everton have fallen foul of. Premier League, a month or so ago, announced that it was going to move towards a more squad cost control ratio approach, which is what UEFA are in the process of bringing in at the moment. What that will do is say, rather than you can make a fixed amount of a loss, the amount that you can spend on effectively your squad costs, so that'll be a mix of wages of players and head coaches, your player transfers, which are amortized. If you need to sack a head coach, that will come out of it. And agent fees, you can only spend a certain percentage of your revenues on those things. And that's going to be 90% effectively for next season, 80% for the season after, and then dropping to 70% for the year after that. So any club in Europe would have to adhere to those rules. But the Premier League is implementing something similar. This was announced a month or so ago, and my understanding is that the 500 million loss will be a backstop to those rules rather than instead of those rules. So any club playing in the Premier League is also going to have limits to the amounts that they can spend, regardless of whether they're in European competition or not. We think it's going to be broadly similar rules, with a cap of 70% for those in European competitions, which will be the same as the UEFA cap, and potentially up to 85% for those clubs in the Premier League who aren't in UEFA competition.
With the knowledge of those potential percentages, and obviously this has to go to the formal vote which will probably happen sometime in June. Do these changes make the Premier League fairer, do you think?
I think they potentially do. I think that the cap on the, if it's a 4.5 cap or a 5 cap, I think that's a really interesting move, because that means that Man City and Man United, the amount that they can spend is now anchored to the amount that the lowest team earns. So there's no incentive for Man City and Man United to try and change the way that the distribution is to benefit themselves, because they'd only end up harming themselves along the way. It's now going to be an incentive for the so-called Big Six and Newcastle breaking into that. There's going to be an incentive for those clubs to ensure that the rest of the league are earning significant amounts from the broadcast and commercial deals from the Premier League as well. So there is definitely the potential that it could lead to a more fair league, or at least hopefully it won't get any worse than it is currently.
But the top clubs like Manchester City, for example, they do have fears, we understand, of these changes impacting how competitive they can be against their European rivals. Do you think that is a fair concern from the likes of Manchester City to have?
Yeah, I think potentially that if they're going to be, if for example Real Madrid or PSG are going to be able to spend more money than Man City or Man United, then that does potentially put them at a disadvantage. We've seen in English rugby over the last 20 years or so that in England, that has a lower salary cap than France, that a lot of players wanted to leave English rugby to go play in France because they could be paid more. So I think there's probably I can understand why there's that concern, but I think it would take significant change in the other leagues for that to happen, because the other leagues have their own not salary caps, but have their own financial restrictions that are probably going to mean that those clubs aren't able to spend that sort of money anyway.
Why do you think some clubs have voted against changing the rules?
Well, I think City and United are the two very easy to judge why, because City are if it's a 4.5 cap, 4.5 time cap, then I think City and United would both have breached that last season. If it's a 5 times cap, then City are getting up towards that, and so they perhaps don't want to be capped on what they can spend. Similarly with Manchester United, there's potentially going to be quite a big rebuilding job going on there over the next couple of years. It was announced, reports yesterday, that every player in the United squad bar a couple is available for sale. So we can see that Jim Ratcliffe coming in, probably going to be looking for a big overhaul of the squad to try and restore them to a team that can challenge for titles on a regular basis. Villa's a slightly more interesting one, because Villa I don't think are going to be anywhere near that cap, and so I'm not 100% sure why they will have objected. It could easily be an internal Premier League politics thing, as much as anything else, rather than them objecting to the actual rule itself.
And in terms of Newcastle United, I think the majority of fans have looked upon this potential rule change as a real boost to them, because at the moment they are really struggling with the current rules. They didn't spend anything in January because they wanted to ensure they meet the regulations that are currently in place. There's talk this summer that they might have to sell one of their big players to ensure, again, they meet the financial restrictions currently in place. Are these changes going to be a massive boost to Newcastle, do you think, going forward, if they're voted in?
So I don't think they're going to impact Newcastle's spending capacity. As you say, that's already restricted by the PSR regulations and will be restricted by the squad cost control ratio, just because, I'm sure Newcastle want to be spending the sort of money that Man City and Man United and, Liverpool will be. But they can't, because Newcastle's revenues are so much lower, and the spend will be capped as a proportion of revenue. These new regulations might well benefit Newcastle slightly if it means that Man City and Man United, for example, aren't able to spend the sort of money that they want. If Chelsea aren't going to be able to spend the sort of money that they want, then it might mean a slightly leveler fair, playing field for Newcastle to be able to break into that top 4 again, if the clubs around them are slightly hampered on what they can spend, I guess.
It's going to be interesting, isn't it? Because obviously Newcastle in time want to get to the levels of club revenue that you see with Manchester City and other top clubs at right end of the Premier League. And I suppose one of the arguments from a Manchester City might be, well, if we bring in 800 million a year from club revenue, but the cap only allows us to spend 500 million, how is that fair?
Yeah, and I'd absolutely be sympathetic to that argument. It potentially does mean that clubs are going to be, perhaps not as innovative in what they're doing in trying to earn revenue. Although I guess potentially as a fan, that might be beneficial because it means there's perhaps less drive for increasing prices for tickets, for shirts, etc. But yeah, I could absolutely understand why if Man City are bringing in that amount of money, but are artificially capped on what they can spend because of a hard limit, I can absolutely understand why they'd be a little bit annoyed with that.
But to me, I think it is quite exciting. If I take my Newcastle bias away from it, I think it'd be really good to see teams like Bournemouth, for example, or Wolves not being forced into selling their best players to a team that's already in the top six, and they can hold on to a Dominic Solanke or a Pedro Neto and build and actually really have a fair chance of getting into the top six. And they can afford to dream potentially under these new rules.
Well, except the clubs will still be capped by the squad cost ratio. So I'm a Wolves fan, and we didn't spend much money this season because we had to sell players to come in under the PSR regulations, and we're above what the squad cost target will be. So even with these new rules, the squad cost ratio target will mean that we would still need to be selling a Pedro Neto or a João Gomez or a Ryan Aït-Nouri this summer. These new rules aren't going to affect those clubs lower down the league because they're not getting close to spending that sort of money anyway, and they're going to be restricted by the squad cost ratio before they can get close to spending 500 million a season.
Can you just explain a bit more about this, the squad cost ratio then?
Yeah, no problem. So basically, we don't know the details for this yet. This was announced earlier this year, and this is following UEFA bringing this in for this year. So what UEFA have decided is that rather than saying a club is allowed to make a certain amount of loss per year, which is what they've done previously, they are limiting the amount that clubs can spend on their playing staff, effectively. The wages of the players and the coaches, if you need to sack a coach, your transfer fees, which are amortized, your agents' fees, the amount that you can spend on that will be determined as a percentage of your revenue. So what it's looking like is, for example, looking at this season, Newcastle's revenues were at about 255 million. Their squad costs were about 248 million. So the Newcastle would have a squad cost ratio of 97%. And that will be above what the Premier League allows and what UEFA allow. So because most clubs in the league aren't even earning 500 million in revenue, never mind being able to spend that on their squads, they're not going to be restricted by the new regulations that came in yesterday, because they're going to be impacted more by the squad cost control ratio.
Okay, so that is news to me. You can see how unfamiliar I am with these these new proposals, because I was sitting there thinking this is going to be a really good thing for the lower end teams, but clearly not so much.
Because all we're getting is bits of news, and these haven't been voted in, so we don't know the exact details for the squad cost ratio yet. We don't know the exact details for this anchoring cap yet. All we know is that the Premier League are looking at it, and we'll get the information in due course. But it's also been a little bit complicated. So like the BBC report yesterday was saying that this new anchoring would replace the current PSR. And I guess it is kind of, but it's also in conjunction with this squad cost ratio, which is going to be the limiting factor for the vast majority of clubs in the league who are spending more than the squad cost ratio will almost certainly allow them to.
So with that in mind, the squad cost ratio, why would a team like a Bournemouth or a Wolves, for example, why would they vote in favour of it if they're still going to be impacted? Is it because they're two separate entities, the kind of new rules and the squad cost ratio?
Yeah, they're both going to be separate. I can absolutely understand why the big clubs, why the European clubs are happy to bring in the score cost ratio, because they're going to be bound by that at UEFA level anyway. So they're going to be bound by a squad cost ratio. So it absolutely makes sense for the teams playing regularly in Europe, who are going to have to meet UEFA's requirements, to also want those same restrictions to be across the Premier League. And I guess it's just a little bit of safeguarding for a club like Wolves, for example. We may be looking at it and thinking our owners aren't going to be putting in billions per season. And so we're happy if everyone's squad cost ratio is 70%. If every club's going to be sustainable, we might well be happy in that position and then finishing 15th each season, for example. Whereas if there were no restrictions, maybe we get leapfrogged by a Nottingham Forest, for example, who are prepared to spend a lot more money than other clubs. So there's potentially a little bit of self-interest there. I guess as well that if what the squad cost ratio may do is, and what this new regulation may do, is potentially stop the rising of player wages. And we all sit here and think about players earning £300,000-400,000 a week, and obviously that's a lot of money. But if the wages are reduced, chances are the beneficiaries of that will be the club owners. That we've seen this sort of cap in America, where they have salary caps, they have caps on the amount that the workers effectively can earn, and the beneficiaries for that are the billionaire owners of the clubs rather than anyone else.
So who are the biggest winners, do you think, of the proposed new changes?
I think the squad cost ratio, I think that Manchester United will probably do very well out of it, because their revenues are very high and have stayed high. I think the clubs whose revenues are high are going to benefit the most. The clubs who want to spend more but can't are going to be the clubs that benefit the least. So, Newcastle are probably going to be one of the biggest losers from the squad cost ratio, because they're going to have artificial restrictions on the amount they can spend rather than, the amount of cash that's in the bank.
Interesting. And in terms of the changes that were talked about on Monday, how would you rank Newcastle in terms of being, a loser or a winner out of that vote?
So I'd say the big winners are potentially the teams at the bottom of the league, because there's going to be incentives for every team in the league to grow the pie, essentially. So there's going to be that incentive there. I think Newcastle are potentially one of the beneficiaries of it, because they're not going to be able to reach 500 million spending in a season anyway, because of the squad cost ratio. So that new restriction isn't going to restrict Newcastle, but it might well restrict some of Newcastle's rivals. That it might well place a restriction on the amount of money that Chelsea, Man City, Man United can spend in a season, which potentially benefits Newcastle, in a race for the Champions League.
And why do you think the Premier League have kind of come to the table and proposed this and said, right, do you guys want us to go into more detail? If you vote yes, we'll go away and we'll come back next month with the final details of the plan. Why do you think they've come to the table with this plan?
Well, I guess one of the things is that the people who run the Premier League are the clubs. The clubs are the shareholders. So you have the administrators of the league, but it's the clubs who are the administrators and make the decisions. I guess one potential thing is noticeable that none of the clubs who have voted against this have American owners. This is moving towards the sorts of salary caps that they have in America, and I generally think that most clubs in the league are happy on things that will put downward pressure on wages. I think they probably look at wages and transfer fees to a lesser extent, but wages in particular, and just see it as vast amounts of money that the clubs are losing. So I think that anything that could potentially put downward pressure on those wages is going to be something that club owners are interested in, particularly if it's something that's going across the entire board. So it's not just going to disadvantage one club.
Interesting, very interesting. Well, I'm certainly learning a lot more than I expected to, because I did try and read around this, and my head was kind of blown before I even spoke to you, Tom. So thank you for providing even more stuff for me to get my head around, and to you guys watching and listening. I do hope this has helped somewhat explain the potential changes that could come into place from the 2025-26 season. If you're watching on the YouTube channel, please give the video a thumbs up and hit subscribe. If you're on the audio channel, leave us a rating and review. Thank you very much as always for tuning in, and head over to chroniclelive.co.uk for all the latest Newcastle United.